Okay, so we got it up.
Cool.
Should probably take some reference material out. Okay, guys ready?
Sure.
Okay. So welcome today to the Friday weekly seminar sponsored by the Center for Transportation Studies. My name is Chris Monsieur. I'm a faculty member in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and with Rob Bertini and Jennifer Dill, we organize in this seminar. So today we have two co-presenters, Robert Hastings, the project architect with TriMet, and Arun Jain, chief urban designer with the City of Portland Bureau of Planning, and they're here today to present Station as Place in the Urban Room. As a reminder, if you have a question to ask, make sure that you press down on the button on the microphone, since this seminar is also being broadcast live on the web. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers today.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone who's here attending the seminar. I'm Bob Hastings, a project architect with TriMet, and with my colleague, Arun Jain, with the City of Portland Bureau of Planning, and he's the chief urban designer, and he can give you a little bit more background, I'm sure, on his background information. We're here today to kind of tell you the story of on the Transit Mall renovation project and how urban design and transit really work together and inform one another. And the way this is going to work is I'll start off the presentation and give you some background information, a little bit on the project itself, but on also getting more into transit's role in Portland and in the region. And then Arun will come in to really take you into the project itself and how that has developed and evolved in our process. And then I'll come back with some examples of the transit stations and what we sort of hope to take forward in our process. Just for a bit of background, that Portland's Transportation Mall is 25 years old, and it's seen a lot of use and abuse over the years. And at that 25-year juncture, we're looking at doing a major renovation and overhaul of the mall itself. But it was also in the process of doing that, adding light rail onto the transportation mall. And you can see in the diagram here that, which Arun will go into a lot more detail, from the north up by Union Station, light rail will cross over the Steel Bridge and travel down 5th, down to the turnaround by I-405 just south of PSU here, and then back up on 6th Avenue. But the major part of the sort of design challenge for us is that the mall is also extending itself into a lot larger reach than it's had before. We are in the process of engineering design, and we just have completed it's called our 30% preliminary engineering submittal, and that will go into a process now of review for a number of months. We anticipate that the line would be done with design and construction by September of 2009. During the presentation, of course, if you have a really urgent question, we don't mind receiving that. But due to the nature of us both trying to sort of get our information to you, we appreciate if you could save your questions until the end, and we'll reserve enough time so we can really go into some depth and deal with those issues. A little bit then about Portland's transportation system and how it has become a tool for making livable communities. Transportation, in terms of transit, I call it the beginning of a beautiful relationship. It's not one that we necessarily understood the nature of that relationship as our first light rail transit project was created. But we've come to understand over the years that it can have a profound impact upon both the shaping of the city in terms of implementing planning and design goals for both the city and the region. But also in a sort of symbiotic relationship, the goals and wishes for urban design and planning actually can come back and shape the form of transit in what we tend to provide. Overall, though, our transit goal is to support that regional agenda of providing connectivity throughout the Portland metropolitan area. But we also have learned that we have to become very site-specific in what we do at the station areas, and we'll go into some detail about that in the presentation. And that we've also learned that light rail stations themselves can become a way to respond to these very specific goals and objectives in terms of planning and design. Stepping back, though, in the big picture, in Portland, with our metropolitan, or with our metro planning organization, they've created what's called the 2040 Regional Plan. And the key to it is that, yes, Portland is in the center of that planning district, but that it also has made a decision to develop regional centers throughout the metropolitan area. The simplest way to describe that is that the region has decided to grow up rather than out. And with the urban growth boundary as a way to focus growth, transportation becomes that much more important to helping to balance this goal for land use planning, also, though, ensuring that livability improves along with it. You know, and that's not so surprising when we take another step back and think about the Portland metropolitan area, is that it always has had a very strong relationship between Portland and the location along the Willamette River as being the regional center, but that it supports other communities around the area, both in the early days from commerce and shipping and getting farm products out to market to serve a larger region outside of the Portland area. And transit, when it first really emerged in the turn of the century, became a very key way both to make those connections to outlying areas and to the city and to the port and beyond. But also, as trolley lines were developed moving out of the downtown Portland area, they became the corridors that growth happened alongside of that. And so our efforts really are kind of continuing this earlier diagram for Portland's growth, maybe in a way kind of hearkening back to some of those earlier intentions that have been modified quite a bit by the introduction of the automobile and the highway. And like the early days where there was a relationship between the train station and the community that was located adjacent to that, we believe that transit's real benefit is when it can have that association with the regional town centers. We find that it helps to reinforce a community's own cultural identity, that in this broad area that tends to become, in our modern world, perhaps more generalized and tends to lose its distinctive and specific character and quality, that transit is a way to, with its design and the way that the system functions, to really come back and kind of claim that community identity. And what we find is as we go out and extend the light rail system as well as our bus system, that we really have to engage the local towns and communities from Gresham to Hillsborough, from Tualatin, hopefully up to Clark County and Vancouver in the north. And we really have to understand what it is that the community has for their local goals in terms of growth management or in terms of community identity. And so that town center, as I was calling it, from Beaverton to Inner Portland to Kenton to the north and Tiger to the south, those are distinct places, and they're very different places from one another. And so we feel that transportation, and transit in particular, is what we're really trying to do is to understand those distinct qualities, because it is the neighborhood, we believe, that is very important in supporting kind of an overall community and an identity of who they are, what they have been in the past, what they'd like to become in the future. It's not that transit is such a kind of predictor of what that culture will be, but we find that if we pay attention to in the planning and placement and the way we detail our stations, that they actually can extend and enhance what we call the ambient characteristics of the surrounding area. And certainly in the slide above here, this is showing actually streetcar moving through the Pearl District, which was an industrial area that's been developed over the last few years. That's had a tremendous influence upon both the scale and the feel of that neighborhood. and certainly is actually kind of predicted how streetcar itself moves through in the speeds and the kind of headways and movements for pedestrians to the train. On the bottom slide is actually Kenton in North Portland with the Interstate Max project. And sometimes communities have rather distinct and unique characteristics. Sometimes they're characteristics which they themselves are very enamored and proud with. And one of the underlying themes was how to protect Paul Bunyan, which is up at this Plaza area. Actually, Paul was in the middle of the street in Kenton where Denver Avenue and Interstate Avenue connected. Some felt that maybe we were here to knock Paul down, that some folks didn't appreciate the kind of iconic quality of his Americana sculpture. But in fact, no, we were there very much to lend support as to what the Kenton community was trying to do. And Kenton in particular actually had already developed a downtown plan. So they already had spent a great deal of time and effort to try and figure out what they as a community wanted to do in terms of their growth. And on the light rail side, we spent a lot of time and effort and money to really trying to support that. So it wasn't just trying to provide a transit system to get people on a vehicle and move from one place to another. It was really trying to figure out a way that the parts of a city can have that kind of relationship between the whole area. Certainly that's what transit's about, but it's also the distinctiveness of the particular place that we're involved with. When transit was first really introduced, and by transit I'm saying meaning both bus as well as rail, it was operating in the city of Portland. It was a bus company, but it really wasn't until the downtown transit mall was created in the early 70s as a direct response to Portland's downtown plan. And Arun will go into this in greater detail, but here's the transit mall from south to north. And as a way to bring together a lot of focus for the downtown area and using the bus system to operate on 5th and 6th Avenues. And over the years, we've seen that that kind of aggregation of transit has really turned to serve both the downtown development and help to foster growth and the development of the downtown, but also has helped to kind of create perhaps a culture of transit in the Portland area itself. And so as we add light rail now in this new part of the strategy for the transit mall, it's a continuation of that earlier intention. It's a continuation of a huge investment that the city of Portland and the region have already made. We have learned some lessons along the way, though, as the first transit, light rail transit extended from downtown Portland in 1985 out to Gresham in the east. That project's intention, quite frankly, was to represent that light rail as a mode of getting around the region actually could be a very alluring possibility. And so the stations in the downtown area were built to be not just serviceable, but quite frankly, very attractive. It was a huge investment in terms of dollars and materials to make the transition through the downtown as attractive as it could possibly be. And even the stations in the outlying areas were built not to look transitory, pardon the pun, but also to look very permanent. And so the materials and the architecture was intended to imbue the sense of permanence, that this is something that is going to be for a long time. When we extended from downtown Portland out to the west towards Beaverton, Washington County, and out to Hillsborough in '98, it really now allowed this light rail system to turn from just a kind of downtown to Gresham, perhaps more of a commuter sense, to now as a real extension throughout the whole region, all the way out to Hillsborough. And the station architecture followed along to that. In many ways became even more specific about the locations in responding to that local context. Beaverton is very different from Hillsborough. And Washington County, back in the mid-90s, still had a lot of open farmland that, yes, was inside the urban growth boundary, but was intended to become residential development in support of Oregon's burgeoning high-tech industry. And it's amazing to see over the years, and in fact that has happened, I think probably at a faster rate than even we in our wildest dreams would have predicted. But based upon this kind of strength of the east side and west side extensions in the region, Airport Max wanted to make that important connection, again in terms of a regional sense, to Portland Airport. And as it opened on September 10th, Sunday, the day before September 11th in 2001, it was a project that grew out of a funding mechanism that did not require a ballot measure or bond funding. It was a cooperation between the Port of Portland, TriMet, the City of Portland Metro, and a private development firm. And that was the goal, is that it would allow development to sort of, again, be focused in an area where the city wanted to really leverage that infrastructure, and that is the area out by the airport. On the heels of that, Interstate Max came along. But the story with Interstate Max in particular was perhaps a region really trying to stretch itself from Vancouver, Washington, and Clark County to the north, all the way through downtown Portland, and then head south to Milwaukee and Oregon City. A very ambitious project, trying to locate light rail along, for the most part, existing kind of highway corridors. And at the ballot measure, that didn't pass. It required funding not just of the city, but also eventually of a statewide ballot measure, which didn't pass. But folks in the region really understood that just because that didn't pass didn't necessarily mean that we weren't going to be extending transit. We just had to figure out another way to do it. And so Interstate Max was a much smaller proposition, from over $1 billion down to about a little over $200 million in terms of the actual construction for Interstate Max. And instead of being along a freeway corridor, like the Banfield project, it moved into an existing roadway of Interstate Avenue, which in fact is the old Highway 99 connecting Oregon, actually California, Oregon, and Washington. By the fact of making that shift over from the highway, it moved from being just, again, a commuter idea of transit to an idea that transit could really serve the neighborhood that it was moving through. And I'll get into that a little bit more about how that played out in terms of placemaking. And so what we've come to understand is that the metropolitan area is full of opportunities. It depends upon how we understand the transit system that we want to continue to grow, and how it's going to serve these different sort of subject areas, from education, certainly here at PSU, the community colleges, Washington State University and Vancouver to the north, hopefully someday, as well as a different kind of residential use, not just single family, but multifamily, and hopefully other family or residential development that have an occurrence closer to these transit corridors. And certainly in the downtown area, we've seen the commercial and retail has really responded to transit becoming more involved with the city itself. And because of, I guess, again, transit's connections, cultural and recreational activities are really starting to happen more and more. But we understand that we have to be sensitive to those desires. We have to be sensitive to that local context and what we do and how we do it. And so using Portland State perhaps as an example, that each town center in a way becomes its own opportunity for a city into itself. But it's a city that recognizes it's part of a larger metropolitan area. That it's not just a local entity like PSU was, a local college at one point, but now perhaps can serve to become more of a regional resource. And as we think of Portland as our sort of city of learning, it's also learning opportunities throughout the whole region, not just localized at that specific location. And that's very, very different from a lot of other planning efforts that are happening throughout the United States even today. And so here, even at the Urban Plaza, the design of this plaza was very much about signifying that it is a place within a larger whole. But in and of itself, it is a city unto itself. And that we have to really recognize how we do that, especially as we begin to think about the challenge on the transit mall. How can we strengthen those regional connections and at the same time make places that are very specific and well designed for themselves? So at this point, Arun, I'll turn that over to you.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Bob. Picking up from where Bob left off, there's been some larger objectives clearly about how the transit mall needs to develop in the context of the downtown. So the kinds of challenges we have with regards to the transit mall in the city is really to think of it as a revitalization opportunity, and also quite critically, I think, to build on success. Now, to build on the success of the mall as it is right now as a bus mall, and it's done dramatic things. But let me sort of recap a little bit very quickly about the sort of background in which we are trying to do this. The transit mall was built in the late 70s. It was a primary component of the downtown plan. Its purpose ostensibly has been to provide be a high-quality transit corridor and spine through the downtown, and to in fact complement the east-west retail corridor core, which most of you would know is that particular axis over there. And it's had a number of successes along the way. It's satisfied a number of city policies, notably the ones of creating a regional transit spine through the city. It's been a defining and organizing element for how the central city sort of functions and organizes as it sort of behaves. It's made transit attractive. It's just simply by the service efficiency and clarity of the system. And it's enhanced the accessibility, and by that I mean it's actually done as a wonderful service, because it's provided service to the highest concentration of users, and it's reduced our overall traffic burdens. So if you can look at up here, this is the bus circulation pattern prior to the transit mall, and this is the bus circulation after. So it's done some pretty dramatic things. It doesn't mean we don't have persistent issues. Runs a certain list. Notably there have been changes in ground floor uses. We've over the last 20 years, we've had a shift in retail mix and changes in location. We've had changes in context, and we've lost our headquarter financial component in the downtown. We're not sure if that's going to replace itself. So there's certain market segments that have altered over time. And then despite the sort of thinking that at the best we were using the best materials and design thinking at the time, there's the inevitable wear and tear that happens when elements age. There's noise impediments, as I'm sure you've all experienced, and you can design the best possible environment you like, but the noise is an impediment it does impact curbside uses. There's uncoordinated retail development. There's never been a clear hierarchy of how retail should orchestrate itself on the mall. There's been, quite honestly, uneven stewardship and management of the mall. And that, both the public and the private realms are to blame for that. It does, however, present us with a number of opportunities for change. If you were to think about the fact that right now the transit mall is ostensibly bus, a high-intensity bus service, the introduction of light rail will do a number of things. It will alter the passenger distribution of how people sort of congregate and disperse on the mall around the station areas. Right now, the bus service is pretty well organized to cast a sort of somewhat even dispersion of people throughout the length of the mall. And so light rail has a completely different dynamic to it, because you've got fewer stations, and you're going to have different sizes of people waiting and getting off. So that corresponds to a shift in activity levels. It's a much larger mall. As you can see back here, the existing mall is just about till about there, and we're extending it all the way to the end. So it's going from one end of the City Union Station right down to the freeway down here. And if you calculate it in both directions, it's about 117 block faces. And so the challenges of how you can sort of react to that they're quite profound. So I think there's a number of revitalization considerations that we have to keep in mind. One is we've got to maintain transit and pedestrian-related related qualities as they've always been aspired to, both on the entire mall as well as on a more localized basis along the length of what's proposed. There's a number of strengths we need to build on. We've talked about some of them as the sort of transit, sort of the orienting aspects of how the downtown works. We've got to clearly focus on new and weak segments, and we do have to accommodate short, medium, and long-term development opportunities into the mall design. This is not something we've done very well up until now, and it's, as Bob has said, this is something that we've always sort of aspired to, and we have a growing awareness of. So in order to come up with some kind of urban design clarity about how we should function on the mall, or what our response to putting light rail on the mall should be, we did some analysis. We did what we called an interface analysis, both on the South Mall segments, the Central Mall segments, and then the North Mall segments. And just to sort of blow up on that a little bit, we did a very detailed analysis that said, here's these are all color-coded, but basically what it means is we've analyzed the edge conditions to say here are active edges which have permeable uses through them. Here are inactive edge, partially active edge fenestration. Here are blank walls. Then we've mapped entries. Where are the active entries into offices? Where are the retail entries? Where are the loading dock entries, parking entries, and so on? And then we've also indexed it to what you might see here is to development opportunity. So in various shades of blue, the darkest blue being the most development opportunity. Now, by some measure, we've basically taken the building value of a land value to basically do this rough measure, but it's not necessarily the best measure to use. But just to give us a first sort of take on well, where are the ground level problems? What kinds of issues can we see, and are there future development opportunities along the transit mall that we can begin to think about in more creative ways? So the future imperatives are really to acknowledge the challenges of activating 117 block faces, and clearly we know that we have to have context-sensitive retail development, because any conception that we have as a city, the enough energy to activate retail on that much of length, 117 block faces, is clearly never going to happen. So the question then becomes, where do you take the energy you know you can have and channel it to give you the most kind of mileage along the mall? So I think our original conception is somewhat matured over the years, because in the beginning, when we have the transit mall, the idea was it would become active retail. And I think we know now that, more perhaps clearly than before, that to do so is not feasible. We just don't have the energy, and a lot of us have been debating various aspects of it, but I would suggest to you that the nature of retail that exists on the mall, that would occur on a transit mall of any kind, historically has been second-tier retail. It's not been high-end retail. And we have to be very clear about what is the nature of it, where does it express itself, and so on. So I think there's clearly that recognition, particularly in light of the added length of it. The next thing we have to do is provide enhanced cognitive recognition, and by this I mean it's not the existing mall has a certain character to it, particularly because we needed to build an identity for the transit rider and the civic user intersecting these spaces to understand that this was a mall and this was your sort of place to congregate if in fact you needed to flush in and out of the system. The problem we have now is that we've got a greatly enlarged mall, and we have to worry not just about where are you on the transit mall, but where on the transit mall are you once you're on it, because of the sheer length of it. So we need to have cognitive recognition when you're in the mall in a completely different way than we had before. And we have to respond to the development opportunities of east-west growth. This is something that we've not really talked about. The urban design vision then that came out of all of this kind of thinking has been really two elements, two shifts in scale. One is to understand that we have we can look at the entire length of the downtown as a series of urban rooms, and that these rooms are reflective of the ambient character and use in the area immediately adjacent to them. So it's a basis for understanding and perceiving the mall. And the mall experience itself needs to reflect the varied downtown characteristics as you navigate through it. So clearly, the area around Union Station is quite different than the area around Pioneer Square, and you can begin to start thinking of them as distinct parts of an overall whole. Now, in conjunction with that, the idea of station as place has been mostly to say that we need to think about stations not as just a place to gorge and disgorge people on and off light rail, but really as an opportunity for placemaking, and that these station areas can exemplify each urban room's ambient characteristic. It can talk about, it can begin to start informing better the experience of arriving and departing from special places. And it certainly reflects the desire to integrate both use and function in a much more less linear way. So, this is a graphic that begins to start talking about what are these urban rooms, how might we crudely or roughly divide them. And so you can think about the top as saying that this is the North Terminus, the Union Station area. Clearly we know Old Town Chinatown has got its own particular characteristic. We've got the hotel and financial area, basically on the other side of Burnside. We've got our retail core, which has always been a fundamental part of our city. And then we've got the more amorphous cultural and civic kind of mix back here. And then clearly PSU, the university, has its own distinct ambient environment. And then there's that sort of leftover piece, which is the South Terminus. So the idea of urban rooms is not just a way of sort of how do we perceive the city, but I think it also allows us to do things like understanding better the local conditions, the existing local conditions within each room. It allows us to be more careful about the development strategies we might employ around the station areas as they develop. It certainly allows us to be more focused about the retail development strategy, again, in the light of what I just said. And one of the key aspects in the mall up until now has been the sort of poor sense of management of it. And if we have clear sort of identity about what is this particular area trying to do, or how is it expressing itself, or how is retail focused in there, that allows us to be more focused about our mall management strategy. It does foster the idea of identity and sense of place, and it also allows us to be more strategic about how we stage development as the mall develops and matures. We can look at the idea of station as place in two particular ways. In some cases, the idea of placemaking is, if you are careful about where these stations are located, they can either be enhancing local space, capitalizing on a place that's already recognized as a place, i.e. Pioneer Square, or they can be helping to define a new destination. In both cases, they have immense value. I'm going to whiz through a number of graphics here that talk about each of the station areas and begin to start showing you the kinds of things that we've been thinking about. Very quickly, we've got the existing format back here. We've done a quick sort of urban design analysis of saying where, in fact, is the entire sort of interrelated natures to these two white dots, which are the stations. What is sort of ambient urban design environment in which both investment, development, shared synergies, shared design concepts might express themselves, all in the light of the ground level analysis I showed you. We looked at examples across different places in the world. And then similarly, Old Town Chinatown, we've got different types of development here. We can capitalize on the pavement areas and so on. And I think I'm actually showing you only, we developed diagrams or little sketches that begin to start illuminating all of the different sort of station area elements back here. And clearly in the case of the US Bank and Gateway Station, well, it's the intersection of many different things. We've got the Ankeny Street sort of connection, we've got the Oak Street connection, we've got the shift in the grid. We've got a number of opportunities back here that allow us to be bringing together a lot of different elements in the urban fabric to say the station could really be quite an important place. And then if you looked at Pioneer Square, then, you know, clearly the idea here is to say, well, what if we were to take the fabric of what is Pioneer Square today and extend the entire fabric to the building face on either side, and not only do that, but embrace the area immediately around the courthouse all the way to the shopping area or buildings behind. And what if we started to think about, it could be rather simple, or you could just simply take the sort of same paving material and characteristics, start using flags or banners or particular types of lights. Think about the idea of trains arriving in a non-static environment. So things happen when the train arrives. So fountains go off, or lights start twinkling, or you start hearing chimes, or who knows what. But the idea is that one of the greatest appeals of our downtown is the sort of hidden aspect, the not in-your-face aspect of what causes delight and discovery. And that is also an intrinsic part about what makes place and what allows you to feel like you belong into you've arrived into a special place that can be discovered. So the idea here is again to say, to play up on the natural elements that best describe this place, and to have things in it that makes the train feel like it's an integrated experience. So when you arrive in Pioneer Square, you've arrived in the middle of it, whether you're still sitting on the train or you get off it, as opposed to just some kind of station sitting on the edge of it. And that's qualitatively quite different. You know, these kinds of concepts, what they also do is they begin to start allowing local development to start thinking more strategically about saying, this is my station. And so there's a lot more community ownership, if we, potentially at least, about how these stations might function. Similarly, City Hall, you might say, well, okay, the train's going to stop in front of City Hall. What if, how do you get a sense that you've actually arrived at City Hall, even if you're standing or waiting for the train? So one idea is that you're standing on that side and you've got some materials or some kinds of aspects in the design. We haven't worked out the designs yet, but conceptually there's elements of in the facade, in the building, in the colors, in the materials, in the way the space is basically perceived and organized. Maybe it's again a series of flags or sorts of things that begin to tell you, I've arrived at a civic space. And it doesn't have to be much more than that for you to feel like it's something special. I think what's one of our greatest opportunities is in fact PSU, where we're looking at the entire sort of idea of interchanging buses, light rail coming on here, and the streetcar diagonally cutting across, in terms of what happens with the PCAT building. So now think about it in terms of, well, this is a real student place. This could be a really active place. So if we thought about the right uses for the PCAT building, like a student center or an auditorium or evening lectures or other kinds of events that happen here, it would bring an evening sort of liveliness to this place that wouldn't exist right now. So however that plays out, the idea is that there's unique opportunities that we can capitalize on for adjacent development that's being contemplated, but also the overall sort of functioning. And sort of the last little piece back here is the South Terminus station, which that would suggest that you've got this little kind of loop that goes back on itself, and pending this sort of further extension to the Milwaukee area further down the line. But that's still the next phase of development. So what if, for example, the entire turnaround experience was green? It was just basically going through a mini kind of landscaped forest of some kind, or through a fancy development which allowed you to be a counterpoint to Union Station, either way. But think about the entire experience. If you sit on one of these light rail trains and it's going to do a complete loop, if you were a tourist or just somebody with time who wanted to contemplate the city for whatever reason, you could sit on this train and go through each one of these stations and experience a small microcosm of the overall city. So you would have the Union Station, you would have Town Chinatown, you would have the sort of banking district and the access to the future public market. You could have Pioneer Square, you could have City Hall, you could have the university, all of which kind of sort of under the aggregate tells you, I don't have to do much to understand what the city is all about. So I would kind of end with the idea that, you know, there's a number of urban design attitudes here that we really should be mindful of as we further develop the transit mall. The rooms concept begins to help us understand and define the future design and development strategies. That's the objective. The idea of Stationers Place is really one to be thought of as overall placemaking, not directing so much the design alone, but also development strategy and the way we start thinking or focusing redevelopment energy in our downtown. Placemaking through urban design requires some sense of balance. There's always going to be trade-offs about how much investment we put where do we focus our energies. And in the end, much of the success of what we do is going to be based on achieving that sense or understanding that sense of balance. And that finally, you know, the pedestrian safety and social life on the street are just absolutely critical to the mall's vitality. And we shouldn't be losing sight of that. And that the entire effort is a unique opportunity. So with that, I'm going to shift back to Bob. He's going to do a quick sort of wrap-up, and then we'll be open for questions. There we go. Bob.
Good job.
There we go.
Thank you, Arun. Very nicely done. And just sort of, how do we do this? I mean, you've seen our aspirations that, and by we, I mean this has been a very much community-based effort. A lot of folks coming together and talking about what are both the problems, what are the opportunities, and how we should begin thinking about the transit mall. And I've come to understand through my own work at TriMet is that actually is something that can happen, that the way that we fashion our transit response to these goals and aspirations can make a difference and will have an impact. Here on Interstate Avenue, up on the top slide, was the existing condition before we started in 2000. And here it is now this year, 4 years later. And what I want to point out is that this was intended to be, from the very beginning, an interstate highway, obviously in a very sort of smaller scale, but with 2 lanes of traffic. It had a 12-inch wide concrete median running down the middle of it, and then sidewalks and landscape planning on either side. The commercial activity was primarily focused towards the road, and it was motels, not surprisingly, and maybe some other sort of smaller retail, but not very much in terms of the neighborhood participating and really coming along the road itself. When we finished up afterwards with light rail running down the middle of it, the treatments, the plantings, the pedestrian crossings that we actually provided as a way to get across the street really changed the character of this highway now to more of kind of a Main Street idea and of the neighborhood connecting back to the streets. But it is that part, and Arun mentioned it too, about the balance. You know, what really comes important in all this is figuring out what are the strategies that we sort of play out in order to achieve this sense of balance, that the car isn't dominating the pedestrian experience, and nor does the pedestrian experience make it so awful that the car can't even maneuver through, and it becomes kind of running amok. But that we understand that we're really trying to, when it comes back to the city, of reinforcing that it's the pedestrian values that are really important to having that vitality all the time. What we've learned on our transit side is that we can, by the manipulation of the parts and pieces that we use, reinforce this appropriate scale for the street. And here in the downtown area, as the train is coursing through, you can look at the track materials that were used. The durable. It respected that it was a street, and yet it was also in a pedestrian environment. That the overhead catenary lines, which provide the power for the train, and the supporting mechanisms for that line, had to actually behave in not an industrial way, but more in a sort of kind of urbane way. And so that the architecture of the system itself is the thing that begins to respond to that need for what I call sort of urbanity and civility. And in so doing, those become really sort of furnishing elements, as Arun mentioned, the ambient quality of the whole street, and that transit is actually participating to reinforce that. Because when we do that, again, we're reflecting back that this is important to the community, that this is not just something that we'd wish to do, but that these are things that we're willing to spend our money on and maintain it overall for years and years. And that's part of what, again, helps manifest itself in more of a sense of safety. You can walk along the sidewalk and you can be right adjacent to a train, but you understand, because of the way it's operating throughout the street, that it's not going to bowl you over, God forbid, or run you down. And it's that actually sort of stretching it to hopefully its logical conclusion that how these parts and pieces interact and behave with one another really is kind of this overall sense of what is the civility that we're trying to create in our neighborhoods and in our communities. And as Arun said, that's part of what we're really trying to do here. We're trying to understand how the station can serve this overall larger goal about placemaking. That it's not just moving along a regional rail system, but actually you're moving through this wonderful experience of the neighborhoods and the communities of which you are a part. That you're both arriving at a specific place as your destination, or perhaps you're actually getting on the train to go to another wonderful experience, and that you're traveling along something which really is trying to link together a whole region. And that we use all the tools in our toolkit to do that, and that here at the Rose Quarter Interstate Max station, these sculpture elements, quite frankly, are intended to become kind of wayfinding devices as you leave the Rose Quarter and you're looking, where's the transit station? Well, it's over there by those photovoltaic illuminated kind of tree elements. And that the train actually coming and going is that sense of animation. The people are living in this area, and it's not just a kind of only happening during the commuter times of traffic. And even in places, this is a Cortama station, as I mentioned, mentioning earlier, out on the west side. It very intentionally created a space that was really talking about the landscape and people moving through the landscape in a time when there was nothing else around us but fields. And so the neighborhoods and communities that have now begun to develop around the station area, we're hopefully kind of having that conversation back and forth between each other, that the movement through and the people using the place are very important to that sense of community and sense of neighborhood. Again, because in the overall, what we're really trying to do is respond to this challenge. How do we have particular places within this overall context? And how can we reinforce the sense of center, but also within a broader sense of a regional system? And that's our conclusion. Thank you. And questions? Yes?
Talk a little bit about the challenges of integrating or creating stations and places while also sort of integrating the existing bus volume and car volume on the transit mall.
One of the things we realized in doing the analysis, and Arun was showing the analysis that he was doing in terms of the sort of station blocks and faces, we analyzed with rail coming on, is there a way that we can actually decrease the buses and the number of buses on the transit mall, because in fact rail will still serve that area. And so we've gone back and done a very sort of fine-grained analysis to really understand which lines and where should they be going and how do we achieve the sense of balance that we talked about. And so the number of buses actually will drop when light rail starts to run on 5th and 6th Avenue. As well as we've also tried to reposition some of that aggregation of all of those buses landing at one place and the fumes and everything else to try and distribute that a little bit more throughout the downtown. Both because it enhances where people are trying to get to, but also so that it isn't overwhelming the kind of fragile pedestrian space that we're really trying to bring to it. Does that answer partially?
I'm assuming this would be an extension of the no-fare zone, and if that's the case, where does the financing or the support come from?
Right. Currently now, Fairless Square is from the downtown area and extends all the way over to Lloyd Center. And so light rail then would participate in that same Fairless Square area. That's one of those sort of delicate points where we know we want people to use the system to get around through the downtown area. And so we're willing to give up the revenue for them to sort of circulate through the downtown area. But we're working on trying to do other things to sort of capture that revenue because it's, in a sense, it's an honor system. You don't have to go through a turnstile to get on the train. But once you leave the Fairless Square zone, yes, you have to be sure that you've got your fare for the ride. And so that's a kind of challenge on us on how we make sure we kind of capture that. But, you know, it's it's kind of that good deal that you make that extends everybody's use of the transit system. So in a way, we're kind of priming the pump, if it were, by having folks utilizing Fairlift Square to make these connections through the downtown. But in terms of the financing and funding of it, it's just going to be captured by the rest of our, our transportation financing for the region. Yes.
Will it affect ridership on the streetcar? And what will it do to this system that we have?
Streetcars, riders tend to be folks who aren't necessarily using it for commuting, perhaps. Certainly you get from northwest Portland into downtown and through to PSU, and it's extending all the way down to South Waterfront and beyond to Macadam area. But what we're hoping is that with PSU being this kind of nexus between a regional rail connection and an intercity rail connection, is that it's really bringing even more people to serve sort of the Portland State campus. I mean, I think Portland State, quite frankly, is the key beneficiary of having now this other way to get to the school and out of the school into the community over just regular street use and stuff. But we don't necessarily see it as being get on light rail out in Hillsborough and come into the downtown and then transfer the streetcar, maybe to double back to Northwest 23rd or down to the Macadam area. That might happen, and probably will happen, but that's not the sort of primary goal of the two systems, to kind of serve one hand serving the other, as much as just kind of extending all those possibilities.
I've read something that you have some potentially angry property owners. That you have some property owners led by, is it Greg Goodman, that might sue. I have questions. Have you looked at that as far as optional design solutions in the event your funding is reduced?
Well, let me put it in the following light. One of the key things that that's fundamental to this whole idea of urban rooms and station as place is spurring in getting a better sense of investment or development strategy and opportunity around the station areas. Our conclusion from the sort of kind of groundswell of, let's just say, sort of reaction to the LID has been, quite honestly, one where we think we've the way in which the LID is basically been structured or perceived, even though it's not intended that way, has been one of taking an exaction out of the business owners and on the transit mall. But in reality, the entire conception is to try and enhance the local values and the development opportunities and revitalize certainly the station areas in their most concentrated form, and then sort of the spaces in between as they fill. And I would attribute some of the sort of discomfort about the LID is coming across as stemming from that lack of full appreciation of where the value is going to come as part of this overall strategy. So we're working on it to try and compensate for sort of this lack of understanding about, well, where are the development opportunities? How could we be capitalizing as opposed to simply just taking more out of our overall business environment? So I think it has direct implications in terms of how Station as Place really gets developed. You have a question?
Yeah, just along the lines of cost, if you could give us an idea of how much just the basics of extending the transit mall cost, not even including the urban design maybe, and where that usually comes from, or who's paying for it.
Well, the basic project cost for just the transit mall renovation project is $165 million. That's its goal. And that's up from our original baseline of about $150 million. And so that additional $15 million actually kind of grew out of this process of really trying to understand that we're not just providing transit, we're actually providing, a kind of a future enhancement for the whole downtown area. And what we heard back through this very public process of kind of asking questions and receiving feedback was that if you're going to do this huge, enormous effort, for goodness sakes, we really should be making a real investment in the things that matter the most to folks where they come in contact with the streets. And so the streetscape and the stations are keenly important to the folks who want to use the system. And so the LID was a way to try and find, again, a local participation of the property owners that are most affected by the transit mall with the things that they're going to be coming in closest contact with on a regular basis, you know, the streets, the sidewalks, the trees, the stations themselves. And as Arun mentioned, and I want to kind of emphasize again, is that it's very important, I mean, it's essential to a project like this, that participation in the community and talking about what it is that they want and how that we can provide all that is extremely important. On the Interstate Max project, the largest urban renewal district ever for the city of Portland was created in order to find the local dollars. We in Portland have to come up with a percentage of the overall project. It's approaching a 50-50 split now. In the Banfield days, it's more like, I think, 20 to 25% of that was a local match. So that ratio keeps kind of going up, and it's very hard for us at the local level to find those dollars because we don't have a whole lot of different taxing strategies. We've learned that going to the ballot and asking for a bond measure with people on property taxes, where everybody has to sort of pitch into this regional thing, but they may not, you know, feel that that's an investment that they want to make, begins to be a sort of a tenuous strategy. So here on this project, it is, again, this kind of combination of local, Metro, TriMet, City of Portland dollars coming in to try and capture that federal match. And the final point I want to make about this kind of discomfort with the LID is that what it's trying to do is to take one local dollar in order to get $2 back at a federal level. So it's a bit of a kind of investment where you actually can gain more dollars. And if we redesign and lose a percentage or amount of that local match dollars, then we've also just abdicated a whole lot more federal dollars that we can get. And getting federal dollars to flow into Oregon as a state and Portland as a city is a very, very, very difficult proposition. And so the fact that we can do it in a transportation project which is not just about transit, but about sort of whole city making, is an extraordinary opportunity. And so we recognize that some folks are very worried about this, but we think it's also part of our process to really engage them and kind of trying to understand what their needs are and then what the opportunities are for them to participate in.
In the early years of the transit mall, there were newspaper kiosks, small retail little places built into the mall that eventually failed and were removed. Do we have a critical mass of people using the mall now that we could probably try that again? Or if not, is there some sort of way to bring kind of a smiling face to the transit mall? Because it's not very customer service oriented. If you have problems getting a ticket or wayfinding, there really isn't much help right now. So what's the way to address that?
I think we both have ideas about that. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Mary.
there's a number of different things. On the wayfinding issue, there is a signage study that's being developed by PDC to say, well, how do we sort of develop districts, how do we develop color coding, how do we develop a sort of signage system that tells you overall in the downtown at least, and I believe also the Lloyd, about where you are in the city. So a lot of cities have done this, not just for tourist reasons, but for internal cognition. With regards to specific opportunities on the mall for newspaper kiosks and so on, I think that aspect is still an open-ended question. We haven't quite worked out what are the most appropriate places. Instinctively, I would suggest that we need to leave room for them. But once we understand better the actual dynamics of what's happening, then we can be more strategic about providing amenities like that where they make the most sense. I think, what was the other part of your question? The smiley face bit.
Yeah, I mean, even being someone who's familiar with using the transit system, I've had instances where the ticket machines were not working for light rail, things like that, and it just seems like there's still a ways to go in terms of customer service because the TriMet people are hidden away in Pioneer Square, and if we could somehow get those people out on the mall or have some sort of telephone maybe you could even pick up for customer service, something like that, might improve the...
I'm smiling because a colleague of mine in the audience and I are working on a way for our transit system to both communicate to you of what's happening in terms of next bus arrivals and where things are happening, but also a way that the customer can communicate back to the agency. And we're really looking at this as a real opportunity, again, not for just engaging about the transit service, although that's extremely important in how people can just seamlessly use it and not even, it's like, just going to your car and turning on the engine. You just know it's going to work and it'll take you wherever you want to go. That's very important to us. But how also can transit, going back to the sort of larger issue that Arun was talking about in terms of station as place, help us understand the rest of our region and where we want to go and how we want to connect with that too. And so we're looking at some new both strategies in terms of equipment and technology, but also in terms of changing our attitude about the stations, not as just sort of static elements that provide a cover to you, but as a more dynamic thing that you actually can interact with in a more real touchy-feely kind of way. There's another question.
I think we've run out of time. So
Thanks, Chris.
thanks, Robert and Arun, for a very interesting presentation. And next week we have one of our own students, Casey Nolan, Master's in Urban Regional Planning, presenting on his research project examining speed impacts in the state of Oregon. So with that, I'd like to thank Robert and Arun.
Yeah, well,
Thanks, amigo.
thank you. It was nicely done.
Do you have a second?